Tomorrow is President's Day, right? I remember a time we used to call it the celebration of Washington and Lincoln's birthday, because Lincoln just had a birthday, or would have, February the 12th, and George Washington's birthday is February the 22nd, right? And so now we have President's Day, so that we can, I guess, give proper homage to Millard Fillmore and Warren G. Harding, in addition to Washington and Lincoln, and all other presidents, both now to the present, both then and to the present. President's Day. I had an opportunity to think about President's Day, and one of my favorite presidents of all time, Abraham Lincoln. He probably is responsible for the greatest inaugural address that's ever been delivered by a president. It was his second inaugural address. In 1865, he'd just been reelected in a close election, one he thought he wasn't going to win. And he gave this magnificent address when the Civil War was, well, by the end of the month, or a month from the address, would be over, and Lincoln would be dead as well within the month of delivering this second inaugural address. A part of the address, which I'm going to read to you in just a moment, is familiar to many of you if you've ever seen the Lincoln Memorial, because these words are included there. The war had been terribly bloody. More than 600,000 Americans killed altogether. The bloodiest war in American history. Many in the North, many in the President Lincoln's own party, were very agitated at how they might treat the South after the war. Lincoln proposed another way of looking at it. Instead of retaliation, Lincoln hoped for reconciliation and restoration of the Union. And here are the words that he said in that second inaugural address. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we're in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. In that moment of great national division, the greatest national division our country has ever faced, Lincoln, who had been maligned, he'd been called horrible things, eventually he'd be assassinated, utterly loathed by many, not only in the South, but many in the North as well. Lincoln chose, rather than retaliation, to emphasize the importance of reconciliation, with malice toward none and charity for all. I want to talk about how that speech relates to what Ralph just read. Let's talk about the reading for today. It comes in the midst of what Matthew's gospel includes as one of his first major discourses that Jesus gave. Matthew has at least 5 major discourses. Much of the gospel, according to Matthew, revolves around those long teaching sessions that Jesus gives. We've come to call this the Sermon on the Mount. And in the words there, Jesus is going to do something that seems rather shocking when you hear him read, or when you read it for the first time. He's going to call his followers to a level of righteousness that sounds terribly radical, extreme, excessive. This is the way Matthew's gospel portrays Jesus. Found none of the other gospels. None of these words are not found there. They're unique to Matthew. And I want to try to answer why it is that way, and that will help us better understand what it means for us today. Let's go back in time a little bit. This gospel, the Gospel of Matthew, was written probably about 55 years after the time of Jesus. It was written at the time at the time that the temple had been destroyed. The Sadducean party, which dominated Judaism at the time because of their role in controlling the activities of the temple, they had basically dissolved and left the scene. And what had arisen in their absence was the Pharisaic party, the Pharisees, the strictest sect among the Jews. And it was at this time that the Jewish Christian churches, or you might say the Messianic Jewish churches, by the way, of the four Gospels, the word church, or the word that's translated church into our English Bibles, is found only in the Gospel of Matthew twice, Matthew 16 and Matthew 18. Here, there's a conflict, and it's readily apparent if you read the Gospel. There's tension between those who believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Christians, if you will, and the Pharisees. Very tense. Matter of fact, you read the Gospel, you'll see some of the harshest rhetoric directed toward the scribes and the Pharisees is found in the Gospel of Matthew. The introduction to this series of sayings that Ralph just read to us is found in verse 20, where the subject of the scribes and Pharisees are brought up, and they were known for their strict and very scrupulous righteousness. The way they tried to keep not only the law, but a selection of traditions that had evolved from the law. They were known to be the most strictest sect of all. And yet Matthew has Jesus saying, yes, but your righteousness must exceed that of the very strict Pharisees and their scribes. And he goes through this series of commandments from the Old Testament scriptures. And he talks about anger, and he talks about adultery, and he talks about divorce, and he talks about oath keeping. He talks about how to treat people who ask you for things, as well as how to treat your enemies. And in each one of them, he uses really uses hyperbolic statements that, if taken literally, would really be quite absurd if you think about it. For if you heard Ralph read just a moment ago, if everybody literally tried to follow what is given there concerning anger and adultery and divorce and oath taking and giving to the people who ask of you your shirt off your back and your cloak as well, or a loan, giving it to them, or loving your enemies. If everybody tried to literally live that way, well, think about it for a moment. Well, you have a bunch of hell-bound, one-eyed, one-handed, divorced people who could never remarry, who were naked, broke, and at the complete mercy of their enemies. I don't know if I want to live in that world. You hear me? If followed literally, it would lead you to those excessive conclusions. It's a mistake, I think, to try to read that literally. I think we should read it as hyperbole. That doesn't mean we should dismiss it. That doesn't mean that there's not some important point to be made here. It's just important that we realize that when we read something, sometimes in the heat of the moment, especially in the midst of controversy between two groups, especially religious groups like the Pharisees and the early followers of Jesus, when the tension was so hot and they wanted to say, oh yeah, the Pharisees are strict, you're going to be even more strict if you're going to enter into the kingdom of heaven. And there have been a few groups who have insisted that you're supposed to follow these things literally. Or at least they tried to. Even they acknowledge there's hyperbole here. I think of, for example, the Anabaptists, the Mennonites, the Amish communities. They have, more than any other group, been remembered for the way they tried to take these words and tried to apply them as close as possible to some literal understanding. Though I don't know that they poked out an eye or cut off a hand. And I don't think most people, well, it says you're not supposed to insult anybody. That's good advice. It says you're not supposed to call a brother or sister a fool. We've all probably been guilty of that, though, right? Because every once in a while there are people who are a little foolish. This is how we read these texts. And it's important that we try to understand what they mean. For Jesus says, but I say unto you, I say unto you, I say unto you. And he keeps going through this kind of mantra of saying, you've heard it was this way, but I say it's going to be, you have to be even more so, more excessive. But you can't really live that way. But what you can do is understand what is being really said here. And it's said throughout the Gospel of Matthew. And it's this simple idea that ethical concern cannot be completely captured by moral rule keeping. Let me explain that again. Let me say that again. That ethical concern cannot be captured by simple moral rule keeping. Later on in Matthew chapter 15, Jesus would accuse once again the scribes and the Pharisees of nullifying the Torah by their traditions. Specifically, in Matthew 15, the criticism of the scribes and the Pharisees was this. Some said that if you had money, that you would normally be expected to support your mother and your father, to honor your father and mother in their old age, that you could instead say, I want to devote this money and give it to God, to the temple, and therefore depriving your parents of their necessary support they would have needed in their old age. Jesus said, you're nullifying the law by your traditions. Jesus said, no, take care of your parents. If there's a conflict there, take care of your parents. But he's saying that's an example of how just following the strict rules and letter of the law can often move you away from ethical concern. That ethical concern is something that's much deeper than that. It's much more radical. Now, when we hear the word radical, we sometimes can think of the definition of radical as being extreme. And there is a form of radicalism that is extremism. But radical means at the root. It means at the foundation. And what is the root of what Jesus is trying to say through this series of statements that sound rather excessive? That sounds almost, well, basically impossible to literally follow. What is he really trying to say here? He's trying to say the essence of what it means to be a truly and radically righteous person is that you're cultivating an internal empathy for others. You remember, love your neighbor as yourself by treating others the way you wish to be treated? That rather than living your life with a spirit of retaliation, whether it's somebody you're angry with, or a spouse, or someone who's expecting the truth from you, or somebody who's asked a loan from you, or the shirt off your back, or even an enemy, that the true spirit of what it means to be radically righteous is to be a person who models the spirit of reconciliation over retaliation. Now let me emphasize that for a few moments. I mentioned Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln had, by all rights, had every reason to be someone committed to retaliation. And he had many people in his own party who said, yes, let's get them. Let's make it as harsh as possible on these rebels. But Lincoln had a bigger picture in mind. He realized this retaliation, this eye for an eye, you know the old saying, if you live by eye for an eye and tooth for tooth, everybody's what? Blind and toothless before long? Reconciliation means you have a spirit that says, okay, rather than a breakdown in the relationship, is it possible for me to be reconciled to this person? And to do your best as much as lies within you to emphasize reconciliation over retaliation. Because once the spirit of retaliation starts, it just devolves down here. We're seeing it in our society right now, right? Sometimes it's being modeled by some of our prominent leaders. Not a spirit of reconciliation, but a spirit of retaliation. Not like Lincoln, who didn't try to dance on the graves of his enemies. He tried to bring them back together so they'd be friends again. That's the ultimate goal. That's, by the way, what it means to love your enemies. No, you will not always be successful in seeing your enemies reconciled to you. Sometimes it's not possible your enemies get a vote. Right? The enemies get a vote too. But as much as lies within us, Jesus says we are to model a spirit of trying to bring people together, to restore relationships, rather than simply get into this devolving cycle of retaliation and destruction to where we're no longer in any way modeling the kind of empathy and love for neighbor as we would have them love us. So that's really the spirit of this. And you can go back and check every one of those, but I say unto you, and every one of them has something to do with a broken down human relationship that needs to be restored. And you have two options when you're faced with a potentially broken relationship. You can choose the path of trying to reconcile, or you can retaliate. Retaliation always breeds more retaliation. I think about our society right now. We seem to be in a devolving cycle of retaliation. You hit me, I'm going to hit you back harder. You call me a name, I'm going to call you a worse name. This doesn't work long term. It doesn't work short term. I hope more of us as followers of Jesus will hear these words of Jesus and not be so caught up in all of the really over-the-top language in the way it's expressed, but that we'll see the essence of what's said here, and that it's the core of what it means to be a truly ethical person is you cultivating the empathy for others that causes you to pull back for the temptation just to hit back when someone else takes a swing at you. So with malice toward none, with charity for all, let's move on with our lives and look for ways to make more friends than enemies, to build more bridges than walls. When we come together to observe the Lord's table, it's really a time for us to emphasize those very ideas. That God was in Christ trying to not only reconcile people like us to God's own self, but also trying to reconcile us to one another. Because remember the words of Jesus that Ralph read? If you bring your gift to the altar and you realize you have something against your brother and sister, leave your gift there and go find the brother and sister and be reconciled to them. And then come back to worship. The very act of engaging in the Lord's table is a reminder to us not only that we need to be reconciled to God, but we need to take it as a time to reflect on our lives. Are there people that we know that we have not made at least an honest effort to be reconciled to? Again, that doesn't mean you'll always be successful. But as Paul says, as much as lies within you, live at peace with all people. As much as you can, do your part, even if they choose to walk away or to remain your enemy. You can only do so much. But when we observe the table, we're not only reminding ourselves the importance of being reconciled to God by faith, but also we're looking around us and asking ourselves the question, am I an agent of reconciliation or am I just another agent of retaliation? That's the choice we have to make.